Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Well, welcome. It's fantastic to see so many young people here. Relative to us, you're young. I know you don't consider yourselves young, but relative to the old people up here, you're young. So first, let me tell you who is here with us. This is an amazing group of people we have here. First is Dunn, who is a distinguished scientist. He is the founder of Microsoft Research India, so I'm sure that many of you have read about him and learned about him. He has now left MSRI in Chandu's capable hands, but he is always in the heart of MSRI. Okay, next is Rico Malvo. So Rico is a distinguished engineer and the chief scientist of Microsoft Research Redmond. So Rico has had many positions. He'll tell us a little bit about his positions when we go on. Okay, and then the next person. So we have actually two people from Microsoft Research India. So next we have Sriram, and I'm going to mispronounce your last name because I always do this. So may I just call you guys by your first names? Yes. Okay. So Sriram is the Assistant Managing Director of Microsoft Research India. Sriram is also a principal researcher. He started out as the Assistant Managing Director under Dunn, and now is the Assistant Managing Director under Chandu, and really is essential to Microsoft Research India. Next, we have Chris Bishop, who is from Microsoft Research Cambridge, England. He is also a distinguished scientist. He was, for a long time, the Assistant Managing Director. I think, have you stepped back from that? Kind of, I don't know. Anyway, he does a great, he's a TV star in England too for his science. Next is Victor Ball. Victor is one of the leading researchers in networks in the world. He is in Microsoft Research Redmond. He leads the network effort there, and he is also a principal researcher. So now, this group of people who have been doing a lot of management are going to talk to you about research careers, how to have a good research career. So we'll see. For some of us, you know, we've been doing more and more management and less research recently, but hopefully we can make it relevant to all of you. And I know, even though we heard that we're not going to talk about how to get a job at Microsoft Research, I think that, you know, getting a job at Microsoft or some other high-tech company is probably something that is on the minds of a lot of people here. And so we will try to address some of that, not in terms of the mechanics of how to get a job, but in terms of the wonderful things that you can do, the ways in which you can impact the world, and the way in which you become a researcher who can impact the world. So what I want to do actually is start out with each of them telling us maybe a 2 to 3 minute synopsis of their research career, but especially focusing on ways in which their research career was not a linear progression. Because I think that for many of you out there, you look at our CVs and you think that it was a linear progression, and that if you get off this linear progression, there's going to be some problem. And in fact, I doubt that there are any of the distinguished people here in this front row who have had a career that's a linear progression. You know, you have to take risks, and some of the things that you think are wrong turns are actually the magic. So we'll hear a little bit about that. Let's start with Dunn.
Thanks, Jennifer. Probably, my experience in some sense, many of you will actually experience in your future, so it might relate to that. I did my BTech in IIT Madras, and I know many of you from local, institutions and colleges, and the experience is not that different. A lot of class studies, good grades, looking for, career opportunities. But, back in the days when I did it, there were not career opportunities in India, so I naturally went to do a master's degree in the US. And in fact, back when I did, on my undergraduate, there was not even a computer science major in India. And it just started after I left India. I went and did a master's degree in computer science in the US. And I said, I'm tired of studying. I wanted to go get a job, work, make money, and enjoy life. So I did. But in fact, I think many of you from the statistics that I know about what is happening in India will do this. Because back in the days when I was studying, I think about 30% of graduates of elite institutions in India went towards graduate school and PhD. And now I think the number is less than half of that, I believe. And the reason is because there are a lot more jobs, and you all will probably finish and go get a job in one of the IT service sector industry, right? Companies, Infosys, TCS. Are we looking at third year or fourth year students mostly? How many of you are in the final year? Raise your hands. So have you already interviewed for, how many of you already have a job lined up when you finish? And how many of you expect to have a job lined up by the time you finish? And how many of you are thinking of going to graduate school or master's program? It's more than it used to be, so I'm happy. And how many of you are honestly planning to go to a master's program? And how many of you think you want to go do PhD? So, I was like you. When I did, I've done with, and of course I had to do a master's, not bachelor's. I was done with my master's, go get a job. I worked at Intel in Portland, Oregon in the US. I was a programmer, actually a very nice job. But after about a year or two of doing it, one thing I realized is that I was sort of solving problems that were given to me. I mean, they were interesting enough problems, technically challenging. But somehow I felt like I had a certain limited scope of what I have to do. I was working on writing systems level software, and it was just not fun enough. And so I started reading, and of course there was a lot of spare time, and started reading, and I started reading about brain and artificial intelligence and so on, articles and books and things like that. And then over a period of time I realized that if I kept on doing my job, doing my programming job, there was never a time I was going to actually explore those things. And it was pretty obvious reading those articles that computer science was going to be the one that was going to create the next, mind, artificial intelligence. And so this is exactly the reason I quit my job, went to go do my PhD, spent 6 years doing it. I worked in the area of computer vision. And what I did not realize, when I went to do that, was not simply the fact that I would study a subject that I cared about and new ideas, but that I would have an opportunity to think freely and solve problems that I found interesting with absolutely no constraint whatsoever. In other words, here's a one job, right, apart from being an artist, which of course, you won't get paid much. Here's one career. I found that you can just do whatever you wanted because you found it exciting, because you found it interesting, and you pick the problem, you solve the problem, and there's actually a community out there that's willing to pay you, give you jobs for it, that's willing to take you to conferences in the most interesting, exotic places in the world, like, Miami or Hawaii, and somebody even pays your travel for doing that, and you get to talk to really smart people that are doing the same thing, and, and usually the smartest set of people are out there, so a lot of fun to talk to, and crazy people, because they're all, they're not your stereotype people who, they're all a little bit wacky, and really, you should do it for the fun, and do it because you can actually learn a lot, keep on learning, and you get paid for keep on learning, and keep on changing your mind about what you want to do, and go to fun places and be with fun people.
Wow. Cool. Hello? All right. Thanks, Anandan. Thanks, Jennifer. My name is Rico Malvo. I'm very happy to be here. I've been to India many times, and it's always a pleasure to me. I really sympathize a lot with you folks because about 40 years ago, I was in the same place. And there's some things in common between you guys and me, because I grew up in a place where the weather is very similar to here. The place is very messy, like it is here, and lots of confusion and complicated traffic and all of that. In the other side of the world, the difference being you guys are a little bit above the equator, and where I grew up is a little bit below the equator. And that place is Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. And since I was your age, I really wanted to be an engineer. I remember as a kid, I would pick up toys and destroy them and try to assemble them back again, failing most of the time. But I really like to tinker with stuff, and I would like to grow and do more. And that sparkle was in me all the time, is still in me today. Just as a minor comment, still as a chief scientist, I still write code, I still solder pieces of circuits together. So don't let that sparkle ever go away, because if you are here, it's because you have that sparkle. But one thing I want to tell you is I went to, unlike an Dunn, who went to a great school, the IIT, one of the IITs for his undergrad, I actually went to a much smaller school. But I had in my mind, someday I'm going to go to MIT and do cool things. And sure enough, I ended up there. And one thing I would like to tell you about how to grow a career in engineering and researching engineering, be it electrical engineering, computer science, and all these related fields, is that don't be much afraid, don't pick up a model that you have to go that way and linear, as Jennifer was saying. It can be very non-linear, you can step one way or another. I'll tell you one example of that. When I was at MIT, three students, me and two good friends of mine, we had just finished the qualifying examinations. We were about to get our master's degrees, and then the two of them, one of them 24, the other 23, told to me, okay, Rico, bye, we'll see you later, we don't want to do this PhD stuff. What is that about? And then Brian told me, Rico, his words were, there is money to be made, so I'm going to go do it. And you finish your PhD because you seem to be reasonably smart, and then you're going to come work for me. Guess what happened? Brian went out, he founded a small company. That company started in its first 2 years with about 40 people. 20% of the people on that small startup had PhDs. And it was necessary for the success of that startup. The research that was done by these people, it was a video conferencing company that was 30 years ago, and we produced the highest quality video conferencing equipment that you could have. Today you all run Skype in your machines, but at that time it was really difficult in the 80s to do that. And then a little more than 5 or 6 years later, the company actually grew up to be above $1 billion company. So when Saikat was saying, think about it, can you start something? Yes, you can, even if you're only in your 20s, and it may actually work. And I had the experience of doing that. I had the experience of going to academia and teaching. And then at some point, I went to Microsoft, and I've been there more than 15 years. And it's a great place where you can do research and engineering. I still do research, and I've been in management, from managing 10 people to managing 400 people. And one thing I want to say to you is that don't be linear, back to what Jennifer said. Experiment with things. Sometimes you're going to do a project where you invent an idea, you go to the computer, you make it work, and then you go, what? How does that work? Then you think a little more about it, you try to abstract that out and be a little more theoretical. Sometimes you start on the theoretical side, wow, this abstract multidimensional thing, I think I can cut a hyperplane here and do some stuff. And you say, but what do I do with that? And suddenly you may end up designing some completely new thing that came out from that very abstract. I would recommend to you, try all of that. Don't assume one is better than the other. You may end up doing very well in many of these different models, and the world needs, even that little startup with 40 people, that 20% were PhDs, the world needs people with graduate degrees in engineering. Otherwise, all this evolution of technology won't happen. All right.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Sriram. Like Anandan, I also studied undergrad here, and I went to the US. And like Anandan, after my master's, I never thought I would do research. I took up a job. I worked in the semiconductor company called Xilinx for 5 years. I wrote various kinds of software for them. And I was actually quite happy, unlike Anandan, doing what I was doing. But once I was given a problem of, they had a lot of bugs in their software, and as a result, the circuit that they wired into the chip was sometimes different from the circuit that the customer started with. I mean, the customer gives a circuit, and then you compile it and then program it. And because of bugs, the final circuit is different from the original circuit. And this was very annoying for them. It caused lots of problems. So they asked me to say, you're a smart guy. You can maybe build something that actually checks whether two circuits are functionally equivalent. It's a very interesting problem. It's a combinatorial problem. It's an NP-complete problem. And for a very large circuit, it's very hard to do. And I tried various ways of doing it, and with varying degrees of success. And then someone told me that in Berkeley, there are some people who are doing that. So I used to show up there. Ken McMillan was actually teaching a formal verification course there. So I went there. And I found it unbelievably fascinating that you could actually check that two circuits are equivalent for really large ones. And I built, based on those ideas, I built a combinational equivalence checker for Xilinx, which was, a few years ago, I checked with someone. It is in use even today in that company. But then I liked those techniques so much that I ended up leaving my job and going to Berkeley and doing a PhD in verification. I did my PhD in hardware verification. And after I finished my PhD, Jim Lattice, he once came to give a talk at Berkeley, and he enticed me to do verification of software. And then I joined Microsoft Research, and I worked on software verification. So most of my changes in my life have been very nonlinear because I met someone, and I got interested in some problem, and I just got sucked by the problem. And I was in Microsoft Research in Redmond, and nonlinearly I moved to Microsoft Research India because I met Anandan, and he created a lab here. And most of my choice of problems is by my accidental meeting of very interesting collaborators. So I just live my life in a completely unplanned manner. I recommend you do the same.
Okay, so my name is Chris, and this is actually a very easy question for me because my career has been incredibly non-linear. I guess it really goes back to when I was quite young, before I was even a teenager. My parents took me to see a film called 2001: A Space Odyssey, and it's a great film if you haven't seen it. And it depicts this computer called HAL that was sort of super intelligent. And I was fascinated by the idea of a machine that could be intelligent. But I decided not to go into computer science or into artificial intelligence because the way in which research in that field was done at the time just didn't sort of appeal to me. It was about writing rules and trying to sort of mimic intelligence. And it didn't feel right. And my imagination was caught by something rather different, which was physics. And I loved studying physics at school. So I went to university and I studied physics. And I then went to do a PhD at the University of Edinburgh in theoretical physics. At that time, and today as well, it's a very exciting field. So I did a PhD, and I was very lucky. I had a couple of fantastic supervisors, David Wallace and Peter Higgs, and I had a tremendous time. And one of them, by the way, just won the Nobel Prize last year. So I was very fortunate in working with great people, and that's one great tip I think for research is to work with great people if you get the chance to do so. But I did this PhD, and it was very abstract, very theoretical. It dealt with particles that were very hard to detect, and it was very abstract. And at the end of my PhD, I wanted to do something practical. I wanted to shift and do something that was going to be useful for the world. And I got excited by a problem that I think is very exciting today. I can illustrate it with this bottle of water. So it's a little fact of physics that this bottle of water contains enough energy to power the city of Bangalore, including all its transportation, lighting, heating, or cooling, everything, for probably several hours. But the challenge is getting the energy. out of that water. It's tremendously difficult. We've been working on it for half a century. It might be another half a century before we get there, I don't know. But I decided I wanted to work on this problem. We call it fusion. The idea of we take the hydrogen and we turn it into helium and it releases lots of energy. So I worked on that for about 8 years. Now, if there's time, Jennifer, I have a little story about when I was working in fusion research. If there's time, I'll tell that later. But I was working in the fusion program, and around about the sort of late 1980s, something rather exciting happened sort of across the way in the field of computer science. There was this technique called neural networks. And the idea had been around a long time. But in the 1980s, late 1980s, some people figured out how to make neural networks work properly. And neural networks really caught my imagination because they could solve problems not by being programmed, but by being taught. They could solve problems by looking at examples, by learning from data. And that resonated with that thought I'd had way back when I was a 10-year-old of how we might build intelligent machines. So the idea that a machine could learn to be intelligent really got me excited. And then I did something which was, with hindsight, quite smart. I learned about neural networks, but then I applied them in the field of fusion. Now, one of the tough things in research is having new ideas. It's hard to have new ideas. It's a bit easier to take other people's good ideas from a different field and bring them into your field. So I was probably the first person to bring neural networks into the fusion field. I had a great time because I went around and picked off all these problems that were really easy, and I published lots of papers and gave lots of talks and had lots of fun. And I enjoyed it so much, I decided I wanted to do this full time. So I moved to university, I became a professor in a computer science department, and that was really the third phase of my career. So I went from sort of theoretical physicist to fusion researcher, and finally to computer scientist, and that's what I do today. So I work on neural networks and other machine learning techniques, and hope one day to be able to help us take this next step towards this goal of truly intelligent machines. So a very non-linear career.
Thank you very much. It's sort of hard to follow Team's personality, but I'll try. He is actually a pretty big personality in the UK. So I was born in New Delhi. I was very lucky. My mother was a doctor. They're a product of the partition. They had come to Delhi. They had built their own life. They had seen some really tough times in their lives, and so they left me alone. So I grew up in an environment where it was either engineering or medicine. It probably still is, right? It's that or that. But I think it's gotten better in India. You've got a lot more other things going on now, too. But they didn't put any pressure on me, which was sort of surprising, because every other family I could see was, that's what you had to do. But I was good at math, so that was good. And then I really wanted to do physics, as you said. And I actually joined Delhi University and, did physics for a while. But then it sort of became, there were some family circumstances which caused me to actually change and then end up doing engineering. But during that time, I met a cousin of mine who was a physicist. He still is. He's a professor in Jawaharlal Nehru University in Delhi. And I spent a summer with him, and it was very influential on my growth at that time, because he would talk about the purity of science, and he would talk about how it was so important to have something of your own which was separate from everything else. And there was nothing but knowledge, pure knowledge that you could have. And he would talk about just when everything would get bad in his life, he would lock himself in a room and just do the math or do the science and feel completely purified from all the other stuff that was going on. Anyway, I was a kid. It didn't matter at the time, but it was sort of fun. I started doing engineering, and then, like most of you, getting a job was the most important thing. I got a job, but then at that point, I ended up in a place where everybody around me had a PhD. I had done a master's, but not a PhD. And that was in Digital Equipment Corporation. I actually had a job from Microsoft, too, at the time, and I walked away from that and went to DEC. But there was this whole set of people who had all had PhDs, and then they were always, I was coding, right? I was building systems, but I would see the set of problems that they would solve, and I decided that that's what I wanted to do. I didn't want to sort of just be a code monkey. I didn't want to just build systems. So then that inspired me. I applied for some program in DEC. I got selected for it, and then I did my PhD. When I came back, I started to sort of work on things. And then it struck me at that point that I was very, since I came from India, I was very much into how people didn't have any access to some of this technology. And wireless was just budding at that time. And to me, it sort of became very obvious that that was the way to connect, to get more and more people connected to the world. So I pretty much devoted my entire life since then to that single problem. Of course, it manifests itself in very different form because you take little steps. But these little steps, when you take, you actually don't know what implication they'll have. And I've been sort of lucky in the sense that the little steps I did take actually have had very, very serious impact. So research for me was really, or getting into research for me was a series of incidents and mostly people that, like most of us, who had some lasting impact on us. And of course, this desire to sort of, and not feel pressure or societal pressures to do things the way they're supposed to be done, but just sort of follow whatever, you're instinctively, you wanted to do. So, but it's been a great ride though.
So just so that you don't only hear the guys' stories, I'll tell you my story too, quickly. So mine was very nonlinear. If I had to map it onto one person's, it's probably closest to Chris's, but it's more nonlinear. So I grew up thinking I wanted to be a doctor, so I went off to college and I did a bio major, and then thought, I really don't want to be a doctor. I want to discover new things. So, and as I was doing pre-med, I took some physics, which I thought I wouldn't like, and I fell in love with it because it was a great way for me of looking at the world. Like Jeanette Wing talks about computational thinking, for me, is physics' way of thinking. Everything I looked at, I started to model, which was so much fun for me. And so I decided I would go off to physics graduate school, which I did at Princeton. My father was very disappointed, seriously, because he wanted me to be a doctor. He's not disappointed anymore. And so I went to physics graduate school and I did mathematical physics because I love math. Not apparently very useful for anything, but a great way of viewing the world. Came out of there and everyone said, okay, get a professorship right away. I said, no. I want to learn more, do more before I have to start teaching. Did 2 postdocs, then decided to get a job as a math professor. So I was a mathematics professor for 12 years, working on phase transitions, and then heard about this really cool problem of phase transitions and computationally intractable problems. So, like Chris was saying, when you take the insights of one field, which are found by really incredibly smart people, and you're the one who takes them to the next field, everybody thinks you're really smart because you're bringing these brilliant ideas. They're not, a little bit of credit for realizing they might apply, but it's a great thing to do, to know different things and go into the world with these lenses and see the world through these different lenses. And so I started doing that. It turned out in my physics class at graduate school, there had been a guy who founded Microsoft Research, Nathan Myhrvold. So 18 years ago, he said, come to Microsoft. Everybody thought I was crazy. Why would I go to Microsoft? I didn't know how to code. There were no mathematicians there. There were no physicists there. There were no theoretical computer scientists there. I was giving up tenure. I have a wonderful husband who's sitting in the first row, Christian Borgs, who also gave up tenure. He gave up a chaired professorship in Germany. And we went to Microsoft and we started this group called the Theory Group, which brought together mathematicians and physicists and theoretical computer scientists. And over the years, this mathematics way of viewing the world is a graph. As you heard, it applies to these big social networks. And then I realized, social, okay. So I know math and physics, and I actually know some computer science now. But if you don't think about human beings, as Raj told us, you miss everything. You just do stupid models that don't correspond to how human beings really act. So I pitched forming some new labs, first one in the Boston area and then one in the New York City area with social scientists as well as computer scientists thinking computationally and mathematically and with physics models. And so that's what I'm doing now. And I think that, you know, you don't have to do it in a linear fashion. You do have to be passionate. You do have to be willing to work hard. But the amazing thing about research is that, you know, you get this vision and you can help to create this new world. And, you know, it's so much fun because as the world around you changes, the more lenses you have, the more you can view it from different perspectives. So I know you guys want to get jobs and you want to be nicely self-supporting and everything, and that's fantastic, but if you want to dictate your own future a little bit, I think PhD is a great thing to have. Of course, you don't have to have it. I mean, you know, Bill Gates didn't have it, and, you know, didn't have an undergraduate degree, and, you know, Mark Zuckerberg didn't have it, and these are amazing people, you know, Steve Jobs, amazing person. But don't just think linear, and don't think I want to reach the top, because the top doesn't really make sense, okay? Think I want to reach something interesting, and how do I do that? So that's my advice. Okay, so now for... So, the next question, and we're not going to have very much time, it looks like, but so maybe just a couple of you will answer this. There's this balance that we all do between doing things in depth and things that are important and we know how to do, and taking risks. You know, and I think in the beginning, you can't just take risks because you have to be deep and learn how to contribute to something. But one of the problems of growing older is it somehow gets easier just to keep doing the same thing. So how do you balance, you know, yourself among those quadrants that you saw in, you know, in Chandu's picture this morning? How do you, over your career, you know, sometimes do sustaining research, sometimes blue sky, but sometimes disruptive? You know, how do you balance risk and depth? Yeah.
Does this work? Yes. Maybe I can use this as an excuse to tell my story, because I think it provides a little answer to this. This is a fun story, but it also taught me a lot about research. And it goes back to the time that I was a very junior researcher. I'd just finished my PhD. I'd just gone into the fusion program. We're trying to get the energy out of water, essentially. And I was lucky enough to collaborate. I was in a team of 5 people working on a problem. I hadn't posed the problem. Somebody else had realized this was interesting. But I was the most junior researcher, and I was collaborating with some, you know, one very famous people, and the other people were very well-established researchers. And I should just explain briefly. The idea is that you take the hydrogen out of water, and then you heat it up to 200 million degrees, and you trap it in a magnetic field, a sort of magnetic bottle, and the hydrogen turns into helium and produces lots of cheap, clean energy. But the problem is this hot gas, this plasma, is very unstable. And because it's unstable, that's why fusion is so difficult. So somebody had come up with the idea that a change in the shape of the magnetic bottle might get rid of a very important instability. And if that were true, it would be a very significant result. So we were working on a problem that we were very excited about, because if we could get rid of this instability, we'd have done something really special. And so we worked very hard. We did lots of algebra. We wrote the software. We ran all the computer experiments. We plotted the graphs. And it was a negative result. The instability didn't go away. So we'd worked very hard. We were very excited. It was a rather disappointing result. But it was a useful result to know. So we published it. It got published in the top journal. And then we kind of went on to different projects, went our separate ways. And a few months later, I realized we'd done something not quite right. Not that we'd done anything wrong. Our results weren't wrong, but we'd used the wrong quantity. We'd used a dimensional quantity instead of a dimensionless one. It was a very subtle point. But I got very excited. I thought maybe if we redid the calculations and redid the plots in a different way, using the correct quantity, it would make a difference. Maybe we'd get rid of the instability after all. So I went excitedly and talked to these, more established researchers. And they said, yeah, Chris, technically you are right, but it's unlikely to make a change. I don't think, it's really worth going to all the effort and bothering with. But I was kind of, young and stupid and naive and ignorant and all those things, and I kind of really wanted to pursue this. So I got hold of the code, and the person who'd written it took me through it, and I made the necessary changes and got him to check them and so on. And I spent several weeks redoing these plots in what I thought was the correct way. And to my amazement, I discovered that this instability did go away, and this was very exciting. And I said, of course, we've got to publish this. And my colleagues, my collaborators were incredibly generous. They said, well, Chris, you did this. If it hadn't, we published the first paper already. You did this extra bit. You went this sort of last mile. Probably you should publish it as a sole author. So they're very generous. They let me publish this as the sole author. And it was fantastic. And I ended up, the next 12 months, I was invited to give keynotes at every major fusion conference around the world. About 6 months after we published, the world's biggest fusion experiment, multi-$100 million experiment in Oxford, conducted some experiments, and they verified that this effect was real. It was incredibly exciting, and it made a tremendous difference to my career. And I guess the thing that I learned then, and by then I'd probably published half a dozen papers, a dozen papers, but when I look back on the 8 years that I spent in fusion, there was one paper that really made my career. And the dozens of other papers, if I'd never written them, if I only ever published that one paper, my career would have been just the same. So the real lesson that I learned is that in research, it's better to do just one really important thing than hundreds of merely good things. So the answer's a little bit tough in a sense, but it's really, if you want to do well in research, have a great career, really make yourself think about important problems, go after those important problems, and persevere, really stick with it. Those problems won't be easy to solve because somebody else would have done it. So pick an important problem and persevere with the problem. So that was the lesson I learned.
So, actually I want to first clarify a couple of things Chris said, because some of you may not have understood that. And the reason is because most of you probably are not exposed to research. He talked about publishing papers, dozen papers, one of them. And this is an important part of the way in which you do research. See, when you do research, you don't just solve the problem and then go away. Researchers, it's a community process. It's an entirely social process. All of us here, who are researchers, talk to each other. We don't talk to each other, like meeting in a place or having a conversation, but we let other people know about what we did through these mechanisms, like write it as a paper, publish it in a conference or a journal. Now, this is actually an important test of your caliber. When you do that, there's a huge process of review. The results have to be good. The paper has to be well written. And there is some organization or a committee of senior researchers that select it. And once your result gets published, and of course you often get invited to talk about it, and that's how you communicate to other researchers what you did. And that triggers some reaction on their part. They are influenced by what you did and may go and work on some other aspect of the problem, and goes back and forth, and a community forms around the problem. So Jennifer asked about going in depth or breadth. It's something that you'll figure out when you go out there and engage in research. But what I would say is you start by solving problems and go deeper and deeper. You don't start by doing an overview. However, once you get there, you'll find there's a lot of side problems, other problems, similar problems, new problems that you'll encounter that will naturally take you to where you want to go. So the beauty of research, actually going into a career in research, is you actually don't have to plan your life at all, and you get taken to different places simply by the fact that once you do something, you get influenced by something else, and it's kind of it may be non-linear, but it's not entirely discontinuous. And you learn, and the things that you learn from solving one problem will apply to another. The methodologies will apply, and I mean, the whole journey is like a journey in the middle. You don't have 2, 10, 20 colleagues in an office. You have 100,000, 2,000, 10,000 colleagues around the world. It's a very rich experience.
Can I quickly add something to that? So I think everything Anand said is correct. The other thing I would just add to that, actually this is not answering the question you asked, but I guess we went in a different direction, so we'll go with that. What Anand says is, the other thing that is very important is to surround yourself with very smart people. I think that is, to me, that has been the key, because they up your game, right? No matter where your limits are, your limits get extended if you're around people who are critical thinkers, who can actually challenge you, who are not afraid. So for example, if you go to grad school, which I recommend and which I encourage you to do, be completely open about challenging your professors. I know the culture is different, I've grown in the same culture, I understand that, but it's up to you to change it. You're the young generation, so challenge them. They're smart, they've got experience, and similarly when you find jobs, it's not just the money that should attract you, it should be the caliber of the people you're going to work with, because they are the ones that are going to influence your life as you move on, and they will keep pushing you to the next level of things, and eventually you'll end up in a place where hopefully you really like. So.
Believe it or not, we seem to be out of time. We're about, pardon? Yes, we're out of time for the fixed part of this, which is fine. So I hope hearing all of this kind of craziness about this journey, which is a wonderful journey, and it's different for each person, and you bring in so many things, and you think about all the kinds of things that we heard in the talks this morning about advancing the state of the art, about asking the questions about how your technology is being used, and not just saying, I'm a computer scientist or I'm a physicist, but what would a psychologist say, and how are people going to look at this? And then also understanding why there is this big gap that Ed talked about in the jobs in computer science. But if there's somebody sitting out here who doesn't have a degree in computer science and is thinking, I did the wrong thing. No, you didn't do the wrong thing. You can take that mechanical engineering degree or that math degree or that physics degree, and you can do computer science and you can do data science. Yes, you have to learn something, but it's not, I didn't know how to code, and I went to Microsoft and started a group. It's okay, I knew something. Okay, and hopefully all of you know something, and make sure you know that something well.
Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.